January Andrews opens the story by admitting she has a fatal flaw. In her own life and in the romantic stories she writes, she believes every person builds themselves around one self-protecting trait that eventually stops serving them. Her own flaw is being a hopeless romantic, someone who constantly tells herself a beautiful story about her own life, complete with drama, meaning and golden light. Her tendency began when she was 12, at the moment her parents told her her mother might have breast cancer. In that terrifying moment, her quiet, bookish father suddenly became playful and dragged January and her mother out dancing at a mediocre steakhouse. They danced, sang, drank, and laughed until joy and love temporarily pushed away fear. That night, as her parents held hands in the car and the streetlights flickered across the windows, January promised herself that her life would always be filled with love, beauty, and purpose. She began to believe in the comforting story that everything would always be okay. At 28, her story looked perfect. Cancer-free parents, spontaneous handsome boyfriend Jacques, a cute apartment in Queens, and a career writing romance. But one plot hole shattered everything. Now, at 29, her father dead, her relationship over, her finances depleted, and her living situation unstable, she arrives at a lake house that fills her with nausea. This is the secret house her father owned, the house that revealed he had lived a second life she knew nothing about. She forces herself up to the beautiful cottage, pretending it's just an Airbnb, but the truth is suffocating. Her father had hidden this home from her and her mother. The anger, grief, and betrayal feel like they're waiting for her behind the door. She hopes irrationally that the key won't work or that her father might somehow still be alive. But the key turns easily and she steps into silence. Inside she faces fresh pain. She remembers her mother's call telling her her father had died of a stroke, and then the deeper grief of realizing the man she knew wasn't the whole truth. The house itself is stylish and bohemian, nothing like the home her mother would have built. Everything inside is unfamiliar and unsettling, filled with objects that don't fit with the father she knew. It makes her feel sick imagining him living here. As she's trying to absorb all this, her best friend Shadi calls and jokingly asks if the house has a sex dungeon. January drinks straight from a gin bottle as she walks through the house, narrating what she sees to Shadi. She finds a framed New York Times bestsellers list, and on it, her own book at number 15, along with the name she least wants to see. Her college rival Augustus, now Augustus, serious author, whose book placed even higher on the list. The conversation with Shadi turns into their usual banter. Jokes about whether the house might be a grow house, the unopened letter from January's father that she's terrified to read, and Shadi's dramatic love life. January steps outside onto the deck, absorbing the beauty of the lake at sunset and imagining how perfect the place could be if it didn't belong to her father's secret life. While she's talking, she notices someone on the neighboring deck. A man with curly brown hair reading and drinking beer. She hopes he didn't overhear her yelling about footjob quid pro quo. But when she tries to greet him, he responds with a lazy, teasing drawl, making it clear he did hear. He keeps his tone cold and uninterested, giving the impression he wants nothing to do with her. January tries to be polite, saying she'll be living next door for the summer, but he only waves dismissively and sarcastically tells her to let him know if she needs sugar. When he adds a joke about a sexual fetish depot, she snaps back, saying she'll just follow his car there. He laughs, unbothered, but still doesn't look at her. Frustrated, embarrassed, and angry, January retreats inside. As she slides the glass door closed, she hears him mutter one final word, "Liar," before she shuts herself in, realizing she might have to hide from this grumpy neighbor all summer. January Andrews is blocked. She sits down in her father's lake house, opens a blank document, and finds that the white page stares back like an accusation. Her work, writing romantic comedies about happily ever afters, depends on her ability to believe those endings, and she realizes she believed in them until her father's funeral. The pattern of her life had always been trial followed by happy ending. Moments of crisis for her family turned into renewed joy, as if calamity had a reliable redemption attached. They had danced after scares, celebrated after surgeries, and filled their lives with new classes and trips to prove they could make the most of time. But now the happy ending has failed to arrive. Her father is gone, and with him, the sturdiness of the story she'd told herself for years. At the funeral, January feels disconnected, as though she has sleepwalked into that place of black suits and murmured condolences. She wanders the foyer of the Episcopalian church, disoriented by the ritual of mourning, and notices a woman she doesn't know, an older stranger who moves toward her with a look she cannot read. The woman smells of vanilla and citrus and greets January by name with a shaky familiarity. She calls herself an old friend of January's father, holds herself together awkwardly, and then presses an envelope into January's hand. On top of the envelope rests a key with an address on its tag written in her father's unmistakable hand. The woman says the house is on Lake Michigan and that her father always thought January would love it. She tells January the letter inside the envelope is for her birthday, months away, and that she can open it then or whenever she's ready. Her mother appears behind the stranger and freezes with a murderous look. When the woman says her father never stopped talking about January, Mom hisses the woman's name, Sonia. In an instant, the structure of what January knows about her life splinters. While January has been in the dark about this second life, her mother apparently has not. The funeral, meant to close a chapter, has opened another wound wide and bright. Back at the lake house that night, January tries to work, but the ghost of everything keeps crowding in. An email from her agent, Anya, sits unread in her inbox. Sandy Lowbooks wants another manuscript, and Anya expects January to deliver, to grin and birth it despite everything. The rude cheer of the message, its tempting bossy affection, only highlights how impossible the task feels. Writing seems harder than ever. The grief, the betrayal about her father, the collapse of her relationship with Jacques, her dwindled finances, and the enormity of the house and its unfamiliar furnishings conspire to make even the simplest act of sitting down to type feel insurmountable. She paces the rooms and tries to read, trying to distract herself from the uneasy thought that any of the beds in the house might have been used by her father and Sonia. She imagines memories of childhood boat mornings with her father, the small, private rituals he used to carve out for them, and now wonders whether those moments were laced with guilt or recovery after weekends spent somewhere else. The ache of loss deepens. As night falls, the house grows hot and sleep doesn't come. She dozes and then jerks awake to the blast of music coming from the neighbor's house, the same house she's already assessed as belonging to the Grump. Through the open window she sees a rowdy party in progress, people singing, laughing and holding bottles high. The music is loud and relentless, and in her sleep-deprived, raw state, it feels like a personal assault. January tries to close windows and let the sound die down, but it persists. She stews, imagines calling the police, and then, fueled by a mixture of righteous offense and the brittle emotionalness of grief, she marches across and rings her neighbor's doorbell. No one answers. The partygoers ignore her. She bangs on the door, waits, and then, defeated and cranky, trudges back home. The noise continues. She can't sleep and takes a paperback to the deck to read by phone light, but the dead bulbs outside force her to squint into the dark. The neighbor's single fluorescent bulb casts fragile light onto his deck. When something shifts in the shadows, she screams. It's him, the Grump, who leaps up, startled as much as she is. They exchange barbed remarks. January, still raw, tries to ask politely for quiet, but her usual confident, glitter-sprinkled old self is gone. Instead, she snaps a comment about sad boy angsting music, an attempt at sarcasm that reveals her brittle mood more than humor. The Grump replies with a weary, reproachful logic. It's a summer Saturday in a neighborhood of vacation homes. Late music is to be expected. He points out that maybe a new neighbor could show leniency. His straight-to-the-point tone and calmness contrast with her frayed outburst. For a moment they simply stand, silhouetted in the dim porch lighting, each waiting for the other to break. January, overwhelmed by everything, the funeral, the revelation of the mistress, her failed relationship, her stalled career, blurts out, "I'm so tired." That admission acts as a small human bridge. The Grump stiffens. The music falters. He moves inside and moments later returns the party to silence. January feels foolish for her theatrics and for how quickly she snapped, but the night ends with quiet. She imagines a contrite apology, an explanation about grief and betrayal and all the reasons behind her crankiness, but can't quite muster it. Instead she goes back inside, left to grapple with her exhaustion, sorrow, and the uneasy new knowledge that her father's life contained things she never knew. The house is both inheritance and indictment, and January is left to sit within it and try to find how to begin again. January wakes with a pounding head and a text from her agent, Anya, reminding her, in exuberant fashion, about the summer deadline and the need to deliver a new manuscript. The message reverberates like a death knell. The pressure to produce is immediate and relentless. She remembers her first big hangover the morning after Anya sold her debut novel, A Day of Champagne and Brooklyn Bridge Euphoria, and how she swore she'd never let herself feel that way again. Yet here she is, hungover and bleary in her father's lake house, surrounded by reminders of the man she's only just begun to unmask. She staggers to the bathroom, where a framed photo shows her father with that woman on a windswept beach, and she finds, disgustingly, a copy of her rival Augustus Everett's book on the magazine rack. The sight makes her physically ill. She retches, turns the photo to face the wall, and vows she won't let the house drive her to drink. She needs better coping mechanisms than alcohol. Maybe nature, maybe work, but first coffee. January pulls on makeshift writing clothes, curses her unhelpful capsule wardrobe experiment, and heads into town. On the drive she remembers a formative moment when her father urged her to move to New York, a conversation in which he told her to do something for yourself. The memory sits bitterly now, tainted by the knowledge of his secret life. She drives down the town's main drag, past teens, an ice cream shop, and a sequence of small businesses until she pulls into Pete's Coffee, a local cafe that trades on being slightly off-brand. Inside, the barista is gruff but warm. She banters with January, offers free coffee for first-timers, and immediately charms her. The cafe opens into a tiny bookstore, and January, thinking of Anya's practical advice about book clubs being the writer's salvation, wanders in despite her mud puddle latte. The bookstore is cozy and a little crooked, and an older woman named Posey, who insists on being called Pete, runs the shop with the bluster of someone who has been both roller derby champion and civic opinion holder. Posey delights in the arrival of a published author and treats January like a local celebrity, pressing ideas about a summer workshop and warmly inviting her to the weekly book club. January is flattered and a little nervous. She wants her work to be taken seriously and worries about being dismissed as a one-hit wonder with a single book. Pete is enthusiastic and immediate. She offers to order January's stock, invites her to the Monday book club, and insists January come. Feels like a small lifeline, a way to plug into a community and maybe sell a few copies. January agrees. It feels sensible and possibly even career-saving. As she turns to leave, she notices the shop's main display, a pyramid of copies of the Revelatories, each bearing an autographed sticker. The sight sends a cold recognition through her. Then the door chimes and Augustus Everett steps in. Olive skin, knife cheekbones, messy dark hair, the same neighbor she'd clashed with earlier, the grump. The coincidence lands like a punch. Overwhelmed and embarrassed at the prospect of confronting a college rival in public, January ducks behind a bookshelf, hiding as the man she loathes and fears walks in. The chapter ends with her stuck in that small, fraught moment, humiliated, anxious, and very much alive to the strange new web of proximity, rivalry, and past history that now threads through her life. January reflects on what made her college rivalry with Gus Everett so sharp. Not just his talent, but the way he seemed to exist on a different, darker axis from the rest of their creative writing cohort. Gus was 3 years older, a former gravedigger who later got his GED, and he mined that unusual past for uncanny material. Essays and stories fixated on cemeteries, epitaphs, and the varieties of mourning. While everyone else in the program pulled scenes out of typical small-town or childhood memories, Gus wrote with a precision and a voice that made it obvious where his work came from and why scholarship committees kept handing him money. He was just that good. He was also frustratingly magnetic. Not merely conventionally handsome but the kind of presence that altered whatever he focused on. The way his eyes darkened, the small furrow of his brows over his dented nose, and most prominently, a crooked mouth that made him impossible to forget. January admits to being mildly besotted with his prose, and to the private habit of reporting updates about sexy evil Gus to her friend Shoddy. Their actual first conversation crystallized the rivalry. When January handed him a story in workshop, he looked her dead in the eye and said, with a tilt of curiosity that felt like a judgment, "Let me guess, everyone lives happily ever after." Again. The barb landed because January wrote romantically about a world where love and connection mattered, and where stories resolved into meaning, and Gus's offhand dismissal felt like a pop to her balloon. Over the next 4 years they traded contests and prizes, occasionally ignored one another outside class, and endured the awkwardness of overlapping social circles. Gus dated 2 of January's roommates in succession. He was notorious for very short relationships, and there was at least one wild frat party interaction they never quite parsed into an encounter. After college they kept one another in a low-level orbit. Google searches to compare careers, the occasional sighting, and years later, the uneasy reintroduction when both of them happened to be living on the same North Bear Shore street. That reintroduction happens in Pete's books. January, still raw from recent revelations about her father and wrestling with grief and humiliation from earlier confrontations with her neighbor, has ducked into the bookshop next to Pete's coffee to escape. She's hiding behind shelves when Pete calls for her, and then announces she should meet someone. From between the stacks she forces herself out, clutching a regrettable latte, and steps into the light to meet him. Augustus Everett. He is exactly as she remembers from college. Sharp cheekbones, dark, intent eyes, messy dark hair, and that crooked mouth, patched now with streaks of gray and a perpetual 5 o'clock shadow. The coincidence lands on her like a physical blow. Pete introduces them warmly. Gus seems to recognize her and offers the faint initial confirmation. "We've met, actually." January's face floods with heat. She worries he might not remember her, but his expression flickers with recognition. The 2 of them exchange guarded, barbed pleasantries. Gus asks what she writes. She says romance, and his single-syllable "ah" is loaded and judging. The banter escalates into a brittle teasing sparring. He jokes about coldly horny protagonists. She jabs back about Hemingwayish circle-jerk fandom and the perceived seriousness of his work, and the tension between them crackles in the small shop. Pete's enthusiastic meddling, delighted that 2 writers now live on the same little street, interrupts them. January is rescued by the ringing of her phone. Anya. The call gives her an easy out. She excuses herself and, vulnerable and flustered, retreats through the maze of shelves. The chapter ends with her slipping outside to take the call, leaving the awkward new proximity between rival and neighbor unresolved and heavy with all the old, complicated history. January drives out of town while speaking to her agent, Anya, who is trying, desperately, to nail down a commitment about January's long-delayed manuscript. Anya reminds her that Sandy Low Books expects a finished novel by September 1st, and January tries to sound confident. She admits the book isn't written yet but claims it's fully planned. The truth is she hasn't made real progress in 15 months. Anya tries to be supportive but warns her not to lie. If January needs a break, she should ask. January refuses. She can't afford time off. She has to finish a book, sell her father's lake house, dig herself out of debt, and somehow produce a romance novel despite losing faith in love. Instead of going home to write, January goes to Meijer to restock on groceries. Macaroni, cereal, easy things she can live on during drafting mode. She dumps Pete's terrible latte and buys a giant iced Americano. When she gets back to the lake house, the sun is high and her head has finally stopped pounding. Her phone buzzes with a message from Shoddy. "No WI. Sexy, evil Jewess. Did he ask about me?" January replies that Gus didn't even remember her. Shoddy is convinced this is impossible, reminding January that Gus once called her a fairy princess raised by woodland creatures. The memory stings. January tells her seeing Gus in the wild again was traumatizing and begs her to come heal her emotional wounds. Shoddy promises she will, soon. January sets a goal to write 1,500 words. She barely manages 400. Instead, she wins 28 consecutive games of spider solitaire and then makes a stir-fry. Sitting in the dark with a glass of red wine, she stares at her laptop, trying to force out a bad first draft, something she's done many times before. But the words won't come. She misses the old joy of writing romance. The rain-kiss scenes, the triumphant proposals, the belief that love could save anyone. Now everything feels empty and forced. An email from Pete arrives with the address for her book club. Feel free to bring your favorite drink or just yourself, smiley face. It makes January smile. Maybe Pete will inspire a character someday. She wanders out to the deck with her wine. Gus's deck is dark except for a blue glow from inside his house. Through the window she can see him pacing, typing, pacing again, drinking beer, raking his hands through his hair. It's the private choreography she knows well, the restless dance of a writer wrestling with a story. For all his mockery of pirates and werewolves, he's just like her, making things up in the dark and trying to get them right. Monday night, book club. Pete lives in a pink Victorian house near the college campus. A thunderstorm is rolling in from the lake, making the home look like a glowing dollhouse under gray-green clouds. January arrives with a tote of swag, signed bookmarks and Southern Comfort quote pins, and a bottle of wine with posies scratched out and Pete's written in. Pete flings the door open dramatically, drink in hand, singing January's name. Chorus of voices echoes from inside. January kicks off her rain boots and follows Pete down the hall. The house is crowded with liquor bottles, thunder shaking the porch, and loud Pink Floyd playing. Pete leads her into a cozy living room full of people, and 3 enormous black Labradors, 2 sprawled across the couch and 1 across an armchair. The room is packed. 5 women plus the giant dogs. A blonde woman in flowing white greets January with a hug and kiss on the cheek. She is Maggie, tall, ethereal, warm. Pete loudly notes, she's Mrs. Pete. Maggie gently corrects her with a soft, affectionate eye roll. Maggie introduces the others. Lauren in an orange sundress with long dreadlocks. And then, Sonia. That woman. The woman from the funeral. The woman from the lake house. The woman from the picture frame. January turned to the wall. January freezes. Her mouth goes dry. The room tilts. Sonia, half buried under the sleeping Labradors, looks up at her with a meek, fragile smile. "Hi, January," she says softly. "Nice to see you." It hits January like a hammer. This is the last person she expected to walk into tonight. The chapter ends in that moment of shock, grief, and unresolved history, staring straight at the woman who changed the story of her family forever. January speeds out of town while on the phone with her agent, Anya, who urgently reminds her that Sandy Low Books needs a finished manuscript by September 1st. January tries to sound confident, insisting she has the story planned and only needs time without distractions. In truth, she hasn't written it at all. She keeps insisting she doesn't want a break because she can't afford one. She must finish a book, clear out her father's secret beach house, sell it, and somehow still write about love even though she no longer believes in it. They both pretend to be reassured, though neither is. Instead of going home to write, January drives to the grocery store, dumps the horrible latte from Pete's coffee, buys a huge iced Americano, and loads up on easy-to-cook foods. Cereal, macaroni, anything requiring minimal effort. Back home, the heat is thick and the sun is high, but the strong espresso eases her hangover. As she is plugging in her dead laptop, her phone buzzes with a message from Shoddy. Shoddy wants to know everything. "Sexy, evil Gus? Did he ask about me?" January replies that Gus is still sexy, still evil, and that she refuses to speak to him ever again. She insists he didn't even remember her. Shoddy says that's impossible. January once learned Gus had asked Shoddy what her deal was, describing her as a fairy princess raised by woodland creatures. The memory is embarrassing. January tells her seeing Gus again was horrifying and emotionally scarring. Shoddy promises she'll come visit soon. January sets a writing goal. 1,500 words. She writes barely 400. But she wins 28 consecutive games of spider solitaire before cooking stir-fry for dinner. Later that night, she sits in the dark with a glass of red wine and her laptop glowing before her. She has written dozens of messy first drafts before, but now she can't force the words. She misses the joy she once felt writing happy endings. The kisses in the rain, the dramatic proposals, the triumph of love over fear. Writing those stories once felt meaningful, like she was offering light to the world. Now, heartbroken and cynical, she wonders how she can write romance at all. An email chimes from Pete, a friendly note with her book club address and an invitation to bring a drink. January smiles, thinking Pete might become a character inspiration. She tells herself, one day at a time, then carries her wine to the back door and looks toward Gus's deck. The fire pit that burned earlier is cold now. She steps outside into a blue-silver world, the lake whispering on the sand. A gust of wind chills her through her robe. As she turns to go back in, she sees a blue glow from Gus's house. Through the dark windows she can see him pacing, typing, pacing again, grabbing a beer, running his hand through his hair, deep in his own writing struggle. Whatever he says about her genre, he's still just another writer fighting his story in the dark. Monday evening arrives. Book club night. Pete's house is a pink Victorian near the college campus. Even in the storm rolling off the lake, it looks like a charming dollhouse. Ivy crawls up the windows, turrets poke at the gray sky, and the garden glows green beneath mist and drizzle. It's a perfect escape from January's writing cave. January grabs her tote bag of signed bookmarks and Southern Comfort quote pins, plus a bottle of wine she humorously edited to read Pocketful of Pete's, and runs through the rain to the house. Pink Floyd's Another Brick in the Wall is blasting so loudly that the porch vibrates. Pete swings the door open dramatically, shouting January's name, followed by a chorus of voices inside repeating it. January hands her the wine. Inside, shoes are piled by the door, so she kicks off her green rain boots and follows Pete barefoot down the hall. Pete's toenails match her lavender manicure, and tonight, in faded jeans and a white linen shirt, she looks softer, almost serene. They pass a kitchen overflowing with liquor bottles and step into a small living room where thunder shakes the roof. The room is full, 5 women total, plus 3 enormous black Labradors sprawled across the couch and an armchair. Bright green wooden chairs are arranged in a semicircle. One Labrador leaps up to greet January. Pete announces her arrival. A tall, elegant blonde woman in flowing white drapery, Maggie, sweeps forward to hug January and kiss her cheek. She looks like a blend of Stevie Nicks and a woodland queen. Pete loudly adds, "She's Mrs. Pete," prompting Maggie to smile and gently correct her. "Just Maggie will do." Maggie introduces Lauren, a woman in an orange sundress with long dreadlocks. Then she gestures toward the couch. And there, beneath the sleepy Labradors, sits Sonia. The name slams into January. Her stomach drops. Her mouth goes dry. Her vision blurs at the edges. Sonia, the woman from her father's funeral. The woman from the lake house. The woman in the photos. The woman whose presence rewrote everything January believed about her family. Sonia looks small and timid, pinned beneath 2 napping dogs. She forces a meek smile. "Hi, January," she says softly. "Nice to see you." January stands frozen in shock as the chapter ends, face to face for the first time since the funeral with the woman her father loved. January tries to find a dignified way to encounter her dead father's lover and fails spectacularly. At Pete's book club, overwhelmed by Sonia's sudden presence, she bolts to the nautical-themed bathroom, chugs the host's wine like it's medicine, and briefly fantasizes about fleeing her life entirely, driving straight back to Ohio, taking a job at Ponderosa, never returning. Ultimately she steels herself, hides the bottle in her tote, smooths her hair, and slips back into the living room, determined to survive the night. Pete reassures her that Sonia had to leave because of a work call, and January takes a seat next to Lauren, trying to ignore the hollow spot where Sonia had been. The rain drums outside and a storm hums overhead. Pete checks the time and promises the last guest will arrive any minute. January rummages for her bookmarks, nervous and still tipsy from the bathroom swig. The door opens to bring in Augustus Everett, damp, disheveled, and blinking rain from his hair. Pete announces him grandly, calling him the one and only Augustus Everett, while he offers a small, crooked nod to the room and then to January. The two previous moments of introduction feel wildly different. Pete's casual, "This is January," versus her arriving in a room when a visiting novelist is hailed like royalty. January realizes with a flush that she is not here as an honored guest, but as just another potential book club member discussing Augustus's book. Pete offers drinks. First-round White Russians are the custom, while January contemplates the humiliation of producing her hidden purse wine under Gus's notice. Augustus accepts a White Russian without pomp. He leans forward, revealing a thin tattoo on his forearm that January identifies as a Mobius strip. She resents how little ceremony is required for him to be taken seriously. He could look rumpled and underfed and still get more respect than she does for her career. The disparity stings. Pete claps the group to order. Red, White Russians, and Blue Book Club is now in session. Maggie and Lauren weigh in on the revelatories. Maggie hadn't liked the man spy at first but warmed to him after the backstory. Lauren was moved by a funeral scene where a daughter sings Amazing Grace. They debate the twin reveal and various character motivations. As the conversation unfolds, January scans the room and the titles on the shelves. Spy novels, Cloak and Dagger Fair. Operation Skyforce, The Moscow Game, Deep Cover, Red Flag, Oslo After Dark, revealing that this book club traffics in espionage, not romances. The realization is mortifying and, in spite of herself, faintly comical. She forces a breath, pretends everything is fine, and offers the half-finished bottle of Chardonnay to Augustus. He declines, and the group returns to dissecting plot twists and character arcs. Maggie calls out clear misogyny in one character's behavior. Lauren defends some elements. Pete offers her gruff, candid takes. Through it all, January experiences the sharp social sting of being both the object of casual friendliness and the awkward, lesser-known local author in a room that privileges Gus's literary cachet. The evening's conversational rhythms, raised opinions, gentle corrections, and indulgent laughter, continue around them, punctuated now and then by the comic realities of the room, like an enormous Labrador farting mid-discussion, while January sits, self-conscious and inwardly furious, absorbing the scene and the way she is being sized up in a space she thought might rescue her stalled career. January thanks Pete and hugs her, and Pete tells her the book club could use new blood. Maggie humors her, Lauren comes for the socializing, and the club is run by folks tied to the university. When Pete asks how January will get home, she says she'll Uber. Gus immediately offers to drive her, deadpan and unamused. January insists she'll take an Uber, but Pete scoffs. North Bear Shores isn't exactly teeming with rideshare drivers. January fumbles with her phone and lies about an Uber being 4 minutes away. Gus calls her bluff, and when she tries to walk off to avoid getting in his car, he keeps pace in his vehicle, teasing her about slipping into Jello wrestling and other imagined horrors, and points out that she's shivering and unlikely to make the 7-mile trek home on foot. Their banter is clipped and combustible. He insists she get in the car. She insists she'll walk for exercise. He mocks her logic and warns of pneumonia and frozen limbs. Finally, she ducks into his car, half joking about carrying pepper spray and a gun in her tote. He's appalled and amused. She claims she was joking about the gun. He drives her to a tacky, neon-drenched diner, Donuts, where he declares his trick for sobering up involves greasy comfort food. Inside, the diner is a slice of kitsch, orange booths, a fish tank full of koi, and a man behind the counter who seems determined to serve customers in his underwear, white t-shirt and boxers visible beneath the counter's glare. Gus orders a dozen day-old donuts and requests coffee. The man offers terrible coffee for free and decent coffee for $1. Gus pays, and January and he sit across from one another in a booth, examining a box of compressed, mangled donuts. Their conversation opens slowly, about the donuts, local absurdities, and the grating music at the shop, then blossoms into the kind of teasing, guarded curiosity that quickly becomes recognizably intimate. They spar about literature, reputation, and assumptions. January accuses him of being taken more seriously for less effort, and he jabbers back about the perceived seriousness of his work and the casual dismissal of hers. He apologizes for being rude earlier. The apology is unexpected and softens January. She admits she'd like to see what a good day looks like for him. He says she'd be closer if she removed the party, offering a small, vulnerable crack in his gruff armor. They trade barbs about why each moved to North Bear Shores. He teases, she retorts. He asks why she moved there, she deflects. He proposes a question-for-answer trade, and she scoffs at the idea of conversational quid pro quo, until she agrees to one question in exchange for his earlier apology. She asks if he thought the book club would be discussing his novel. He explains Pete never invites him and that he assumed the evening would be about him. They mock one another's assumptions. He accuses her of Googling him. She counters that she might have only Googled him to check for a criminal past. He warns he may answer every question with another question. She retorts that she might not care. They jockey about genre and literary seriousness. January clarifies that her books are technically shelved as women's fiction, not mass-market romance, though she writes with swoon and heart. Gus, baffled, confesses he doesn't understand why there's a whole genre just for women, prompting January's heated defense of women's fiction. Swap her heroines' names to John's, and the books would be fiction, available to all, but because they're written by a woman about women, they get dismissed. She rails at the double standard, the notion that male authors can be taken seriously regardless of presentation while women's work is diminished. His demeanor shifts. He listens, seems to take her seriously, and then asks if she's ready to go. January, newly sober and steadier after the conversation, says yes. The chapter closes on the pair's uneasy truce, provocative, candid, and oddly human, leaving January with a clarity she didn't expect and Gus with a small, rueful connection that hints this rivalry might be more complicated than it first appeared. After leaving the greasy donut diner, January and Augustus drive away into a heavy, clumpy fog. The conversation quickly turns to the thing that has always divided them. Happy endings. Gus admits he has a hard time with them, not because he dislikes reading about women, but because he finds real life to be a messy alternation of good and bad moments that rarely resolve into eternal bliss. He argues that love often hurts and that entering relationships is almost borderline sadomasochistic, especially when friendships can provide many of the same rewards without the wreckage when things end. January is defensive and hurt. Romance once sustained her through dark times, and she can't bear to have him dismiss the genre that kept her afloat during her mother's relapses. Their exchange skates between philosophical and personal, and Gus's flinty realism collides with January's stubborn belief in love's value. He teases that she's coldly horny. She teases back about his name preferences, and the mood shifts from combat to something quieter when he confesses he remembers her from college, and from one wild frat party night when they danced and nearly made a bad decision before being unceremoniously kicked out by Shoddy's antics. The memory is intimate and awkward, and it surfaces competitive, complicated feelings between them. The pair arrive at January's street without noticing the trip's end. Gus watches her closely, worried and oddly solicitous, and January finds herself admitting more than she intended. She isn't writing, she's out of money. Her editor and agent want a book and she has only bad pages and a tight deadline. Gus sympathizes. Pressure turns writing into work and drains urgency and inspiration. For a moment they connect as two writers in the same fight. Then Gus proposes something utterly unexpected. A bet. He will attempt to write a happily ever after, and she will try writing bleak literary fiction, whatever that might mean for her now. They will each write under a pen name if desired, and whoever sells a book first wins. The stakes are practical and humiliating. The loser must promote the winner's book, write a glowing endorsement, tout it in interviews, and otherwise guarantee the victor's success. Gus admits he needs the money and new momentum, while January recognizes the value of having a high-profile author like Augustus Everett push a book of hers. The challenge ignites a spark of possibility in her. The bet could be the push she needs to finish and to force both of them out of creative ruts. They lay out rough terms: weekdays for writing, Fridays for research together, and adventurous weekend research activities. Hot air balloons, sailing lessons, candlelit restaurants, and the like, things that feel tailor-made for romance research and for Gus to try living in a different register. Gus playfully and seriously promises to teach her to lean into whatever dark mode she needs, while she will give him crash courses in rom-com nuts and bolts. Singing, dancing, and loving without fear. Before they seal the agreement with a handshake, Gus asks one more, half-joking, half-true condition. She must promise not to fall in love with him. They both laugh, and the bet is made. The arrangement is equal parts competition, barter, and a challenge that might expose them to their own vulnerabilities. Professional, personal, and possibly romantic. The chapter ends with January agreeing, sensing that the bet has the potential to change everything, to get her back to writing, to force Gus into territory he avoids, and to entangle their rivalry with something riskier and far more intimate than either of them expected. Send the next chapter when you're ready. January wakes without a hangover but with a giddy text from Shoddy about Gus's rack of vintage hats. She pads into the kitchen of her father's lake house and begins to settle into a modest domestic routine. She finds the rose-speckled kettle, locates a French press, grinds beans, and brews a cup strong enough to make writing possible. The fog still hangs between the house and the beach. The place feels unfamiliar and slightly cold, but small rituals. Coffee, a mug shaped like an orca whale, the portability of working on the deck, begin to anchor her. Shoddy's message reads like a tiny romantic comedy of its own. Girl meets guy, girl goes home with guy, haunted hat on a rack, and January smiles, relishing the ordinary pleasure of a friend's flirtation. She lays out a practical checklist for the summer. Figure out what her new book will actually be. Plan a rom-com-style Saturday with Gus for research. Tackle the upstairs spare bedroom and sort it into throwaway/giveaway/sell piles. And finally move her things into the downstairs bedroom so she can stop sleeping on the couch. Watching Gus across the way. Catching a glimpse of him pulling a rumpled t-shirt over his head, later raising his mug as if to toast, wakes a small, private flutter in her. She scolds herself for staring, then lifts her own cup in a brief, awkward salute. The sight of him at work reminds her of the shared craft. He paces and types, hands through his hair, the restless choreography of a writer wrestling with a story. It comforts and prods her. If he's working, she should be too. Sitting at her laptop, she confronts the blank page and the gnawing question of what her book will be. Gus's novels, from what she's read in reviews, dwell on secrets and ruin, the wrong choices, destructive families, and moral ambiguity, territory she doesn't naturally inhabit. The thought stings and pulls up raw memories from the funeral and the bitter, unresolved fight with her mother that followed. The house is full of things that complicate what she thought she knew about her parents, and that complexity has leached into her ability to believe in easy-shaped happiness. She remembers the sharp rupture of grief and betrayal. How, when the truth about her father emerged, she had expected to become the grown, consoling daughter, to hold her mother and make sense of things together. Instead, Mom retreated into silence. I can't talk about this, and January found herself splayed open, all the feelings she'd stuffed for years pouring out in a way she couldn't control. That refusal to speak left both of them alone with a rawness that hasn't healed, and returning to New York only made the distance more obvious. Phone calls became rare, tense check-ins. In the midst of those memories comes a softer revelation. Her love affair with romance novels began in a radiology waiting room, when a paperback gave her a decade of reprieve from terror and a new language for hope. Writing romance had been her lifeline through her mother's illnesses. It gave her agency and purpose when everything else felt precarious. But since her father's death and the collapse of the neat narrative she'd built, writing that kind of story felt impossible, until now. She surprises herself by setting fingers to keys. The words come haltingly, in a diary-like third-person voice at first, as she begins to spin a character who doesn't know if her father truly loved that woman, who recognizes that her father loved three things with absolute certainty: books, boats, and January. She plays with images of January being named for a month, January as both wasteland and wonder, and imagines how, in West Michigan, the stark winter light could feel like dippin' that's made of snow. Memory and metaphor tether the narrative. The way her father described a snow as pure sugar, the particular ordinary things that stitched their family together. As she writes, the ache eases into motion. the recollection of boat mornings and small domestic rituals, the way her parents' laughter once steadied her. The chapter traces how those rituals and stories sustained her and became the raw material for her books. She remembers how, when she first fell in love with romance, she felt powerful rather than powerless. The craft offered a way to hand readers something hopeful amidst their own fear. Even if it's initially only diary prose and not a full novel, the act of writing it all is salvation. The chapter closes with January finally typing, turning the jumble of grief and memories into sentences. She admits uncertainty about whether her father truly loved Sonia or her mother, but she knows beyond doubt what he loved most: books, boats, and her. That certainty becomes the seed she can plant in her manuscript, an ember of truth to warm the reclaimed belief that she might be able to write a book again, even if it must reckon with more complicated truths than the tidy endings she used to pen. January wakes to a text from Shadi, a giddy update about Gus's vintage hat collection, and settles into a small morning ritual in the lake house. She finds the French press, grinds beans, boils the kettle, pours coffee into an orca-shaped mug, and carries her laptop out onto the deck. The fog still hangs between the beach and the house. The place feels unfamiliar but usable. She makes a pragmatic checklist for the day and the summer. Finish the book, plan the rom-com-style research outings with Gus, sort the spare bedroom into piles to sell or donate, and move into the downstairs bedroom so she can stop sleeping on the couch. Across the way, she notices Gus working in his kitchen. He lifts his mug in a mock toast and she raises hers in return. The sight of him doing the routine, pacing and typing with hands in his hair, both comforts and distracts her. If he's working, she tells herself she should be too. She opens a blank document and begins to type, tentative sentences that read more like a diary than a novel, probing whether her father really loved Sonia and trying to convert memory into narrative. For 3 days she lives almost only in the twin rituals of writing and cleaning out the house, listing furniture on Craigslist, packing donations, stripping bedding and hauling laundry, while watching for glimpses of Gus. When Friday arrives, both of them set up at their kitchen tables facing one another across the narrow gap between houses. They exchange mock messages through windows, trading a sardonic "life is meaningless, January. Gaze into the abyss." For her pop culture retort. Then he knocks on her door for their first formal research outing, travel mugs in hand. He judges her outfit, vetoes it, and helps her choose something more casual, denim shorts and a Carly Simon t-shirt, and they drive north along the lake as the sun slants amber across the water. Gus warns the evening will be long. He reveals the first stop, an interview with a woman whose sister, Hope, had been involved with a suicide cult. January laughs incredulously at the grim premise. A cult rom-com? But Gus explains the point of the outing, to teach her about character and detail, about how specificity makes the unbelievable believable. He explains his method. He does a lot of interviews because odd, precise facts, what a cult leader eats for breakfast, what shoes he wears, anchor a story in reality. They talk about each other's projects. Gus summarizes his dark premise. An infiltrating journalist who rises through a cult's ranks and is confronted with the leader's persuasive power, a plot that can either end with exposure and arrest or spiral into cyclical corruption. January jokes about the South of France ending. He bluntly says his original idea involved murder. She realizes his work leaves little room for meet cuties and happily ever afters, but that's the point. This research is meant to drag her into darker terrain to test whether she can write bleak literary fiction. On the drive, he reveals he's been researching a local cult for years. The long, research-heavy project is why he moved to the area. The two drive into the woods, down damaged back roads, and end up at a corrugated tin bar called the Bywater. Inside is a rough, smoky crowd. Behind a neon glow they find Grace in her mid-50s, who agrees, reluctantly, to talk about her twin sister Hope. Grace is a trucker and a mother, and she tells them small human things first. Hope's laugh, the way she snorted when she laughed. Those tiny, intimate memories break through the clinical textbook horror of the subject. Grace reveals she had no idea anything was wrong until it was too late. Hope seemed better, healthier, with brighter skin and a different look in her eyes. Only 4 months before she died of internal injuries in the cult compound. Grace's grief is raw. January's instinct is to hold and comfort her rather than pry. The interview furnishes Gus with the details he needs but leaves January haunted by empathy, and by how someone could be so sure something was fine until it wasn't. The story Grace tells, tiny, human, and impossibly sad, resists easy literary use. It's an ache, not a plot device. On the drive home, the mood is heavy and silent. January thinks about her own tendency to avoid hard questions about her father until they become unbearable. She wonders whether she'll spend her life like Grace, unasking things until it's too late. Gus breaks the silence only to swerve and slam the brakes to avoid hitting a tractor. They both recover air, and he offers a quiet check-in. Was January okay? She says yes, but the exchange reveals the depth of the night's impact. Later at a deserted gas station, January pushes to know more about Gus's reasons for living inside other people's tragedies for research. He shrugs. Everybody's got shit, and says sometimes thinking about another person's pain can be a relief. When she presses, he refuses to spill his whole backstory but bargains to give her one small confession in exchange for one truth from her. She tells him the essential fact. Her father died and left her the beach house. He leans in, murmurs close to her ear, and reveals a personal admission. First to gently touch her hip, the physical memory of their past chemistry resurfacing, and then in a quieter, disarming moment, says something she didn't expect, that he has read her books. The revelation, a truth he hid behind his cheap jabs and edge, lands like a small shock. Before she can fully process it, he pulls away, leaves the gas station, and the chapter ends with January left in a charged, stunned silence. Hurt and vulnerable, stirred by the research, the grief, and the unexpected intimacies that have nudged the bet, their rivalry, and something more toward dangerous new territory. January spends a Saturday obsessively trying to pick the perfect setting for Gus's first romantic research outing. Even though she's still battling writer's block, she knows how to engineer meet-cuties on paper. The problem is finding that flash of real inspiration that will make a scene breathe. She writes a quick 1,000 words in the morning, then wanders the farmer's market looking for mood and detail, buying tomatoes, basil, and lettuce with a vague, hopeful idea that cooking together might provide the right kind of intimacy. She thinks about how small comforts, flowers, a well-set kitchen, the rhythm of preparing a meal, used to be easy when she and Jacques shared an apartment. Now there's no money for such luxuries, and those small rituals ache with nostalgia. Back at the house, she gets to work cleaning out the guest bedroom, filling boxes to donate, and stops to read a message Gus has left on a note. Playful, theatrical, and sweetly dramatic. January, January, wherefore art you, January? The little theatricality makes her chest flutter. She loads the car with donations and pauses on the deck with a glass of rose to watch the sunlight and remember how, when she was young, her father liked being reminded that the world was larger than one family's pain. She admits to herself how much she'd tamped down grief and fear, how she tried to keep everything shiny for her parents while hiding anger and heartbreak. When she learned about Sonia, those repressed feelings erupted into fury. Gus appears on his deck and asks, bluntly, whether he needs to wear a tuxedo tonight. He confesses after some teasing that yes, he does own a tuxedo, an absurd confession that makes January laugh. That small piece of unpredictability gives her a clear idea of where to take him. A carnival, the kind of imperfect, slightly tawdry place where messy human life and accidental charm collide. They arrive at a carnival set up in a Big Lots parking lot. Cheap lights, a handful of rides, a milk can toss, sticky cotton candy, and a carousel that looks like it could hardly survive a sneeze. January delights in the imperfection of the scene. It's exactly the kind of messy human space where rom-com magic can happen. Gus, predictably grumpy and literal, mocks romance even as he follows her through the throng. They buy all-day ride bracelets. He insists on paying his own and start to wander. Their banter is sharp, affectionate, and competitive. He teases her about past romances and she teases him about his laundry habits and one-outfit wardrobe. As they move through the carnival, Janie thinks back over her romantic history. Brief flashbacks to relationships that shaped her, most notably Jacques, whose spontaneity and grand gestures once made her believe in a luminous, cinematic life. She remembers the moment he left her, dumped her in a hot tub, and how, after that, all the shining performances she'd put on for others started to feel like performances only. Gus teases her about dating Marco and the Golden Boy types. She corrects him, revealing she was with Golden Boy and that the relationship ended last year. Their talk slips between the ridiculous and the tender, and the carnival's petty dramas. The couple making out by the porta-potties, the kids shrieking, become a running commentary on real life's messy theater. They eat cotton candy and rib each other about Venmo and debts and hypothetical organ exchanges with a dry humor that keeps them moving. When it comes to rides, January tries to coax Gus into something cute, a montage moment in the making. He resists, then concedes under rules. One death-defying ride will suffice to prove he can be coaxed out of his curmudgeonly shell. He chooses a Ferris wheel-adjacent storyline as inspiration for a character beat. A Ferris fold operator whose small life and one near mistake could reverberate into someone else's life in surprising, redemptive ways. January spins out a fuller, rose-tinted alternative. A Ferris wheel operator who saves a life later becomes the unlikely catalyst for that person's destiny, and forms a quiet, cross-generational friendship that ultimately becomes the story's tender backbone. Gus watches her with a half-smile. January pushes, prods, and dares him. This is the point of their bet and of their arrangement, to drag each other into the other's genre long enough to understand why the other finds it compelling. She wants him to feel what she feels when a story's secret, impossible central moment clicks into place. He wants her to confront the grit he mines for his own work. In the carnival's cheap lights and sticky cotton candy glow, the two of them build a series of shared images. Ridiculous, small, intimate, until the night tilts from mockery toward something warmer. By the end of the evening, the Ferris wheel operator, the carnival's minor heroes and failures, and the tiny accidental moments of kindness and danger they imagined have become small, plausible seeds for both of their books. They leave with a sense that the night has done its work. January has given Gus a place to feel ridiculous and vulnerable in public. Gus has reminded January that a scene's particularity, its unsentimental detail, can turn a trope into truth. They go home both a little lighter and a little more armed. She with new confidence that she can conjure a moment that feels like love, and he with another character seed to gnaw on. The chapter closes with them still sparring, still teasing but closer, their competitive bet quietly folding into something complicated and promising. There is no montage. The carnival night collapses into a slow, sticky, real kind of evening. Too much fried food, cheap beer from cans, 7 small rides, and stories told between trips to the milk can toss. January and Gus trade plot ideas for his cult book and her romance worries. He insists a tattooed pregnant girl ends up in New Eden. She insists she doesn't. They argue the beats until the scrambler makes January puke. And Gus, who claims never to have vomited in years, proves every bit as squeamish as she is. He holds her hair, runs from the smell, confesses an old elementary school trauma, and the two of them laugh and feel oddly tethered by the mess. On the drive home, the conversation turns private and strange in the best way. January admits the truth she's bottled for months. Her father cheated on her mother while her mother was battling cancer. Gus listens, half teasing, half serious, and then tells her something she didn't know. His mother died when he was a child, and his father was garbage. He explains, haltingly, that his obsessive research into New Eden and cults is, at least in part, his attempt to understand why people stay in places that hurt them. The confession reframes their writing project. Her need to make happy endings real is the inverse of his need to excavate and explain damage. That night, fueled by fresh impetus, January orders Gus's novel and then tears into it, surgically dismantling the revelatories and stitching together a new world. Her beach book becomes Family Secrets, a traveling circus saga full of absurdly specific human details. A tightrope walker with a port wine stain, a sword swallower mailing checks home, clowns who are lovers. She buries her parents' real lives inside fictional lives, and finally finds a way to write something that carries the truth without asking for literal disclosure. The act of rewriting kicks something loose. For the first time in months, she's excited to sit down at the keyboard. January and Gus fall into a steady, mutually taciturn rhythm, writing at their kitchen tables around noon, passing increasingly elaborate notes through the windows, trading platitudes and profanity and terrible metaphors that make them laugh until they can't hold a pen. They write and they send, and something like companionship settles between them. Not a romance yet, but not nothing. On Friday they head inland to meet Dave, a man tied to New Eden who is supposed to be part of Gus's research. The meeting place is an olive garden, and Dave doesn't show. They wait. Breadsticks come and go. Gus is patient and anxious in equal measure. When their server finally arrives with 2 ridiculous frozen blue drinks, the mood lightens. Over plastic cups and bottomless carbs, the conversation slips into childhood and confessions. January tells the story of how her parents met at a carnival psychic machine, 2 fortunes framed forever, and Gus reveals his childhood fantasy of running away with his mother to build a treehouse in the redwoods. The anecdotes peel each other's surfaces away. Both of them, it turns out, grew up inside complicated households and learned to tell stories to make sense of the chaos. Gus admits he'd read January's dedication, "To my parents," and found it beautiful. The admission lands like a small, warm thing between them. January, surprised and buoyed, orders her own copy of his book and then does a radical thing. She literal text surgery on her manuscript, giving it new bones and letting the characters carry hidden truths she couldn't say out loud. Back at the Olive Garden booth, a moment arrives that is not cinematic but tender. Their hands find each other under the table. It's small and ridiculous and earnest. Thumbing circles, tentative squeezing, the private electricity of 2 people who are less alone because of one another. When the check comes, Gus jerks back and insists on paying. It's a tiny, ordinary chivalry that feels weighty in the way of beginnings. The chapter closes in motion. They keep writing, keep trading notes and research assignments. The contest between bleak and bright becomes, quietly, a way for both of them to withstand the past. January's fever for detail turns grief into fiction. Gus's excavation of harm becomes a path to understanding. Together, amid Olive Garden breadsticks and carnival puke and late-night edits, their wager blurs into companionship. Competitive, prickly, and unexpectedly soft. January wakes from a dream about Gus Everett feeling disoriented and oddly unclean, so much so that she needs a shower. The dream lingers like static. Not a clear memory but an afterimage of heat and closeness and something intimate that makes her skin crawl and pulse at once. She moves through the morning in a half-daze, the dream's residue shaping the way she notices small things, the way sunlight slants across the kitchen, the smell of coffee, the cadence of the house settling. The chapter is less about plot and more about sensation, how the mind folds fiction and desire together, how a private fantasy can leave you both lightheaded and embarrassed, and how her growing, complicated connection with Gus has started seeping into the places she thought were safe from complication: sleep, solitude, the quiet routines of a day. The shower is an attempt at washing away the intimacy and the confusion, but it also underlines that some things, dreams, feelings, the soft gravity between 2 people, aren't easily rinsed off. January plans a focused Saturday to write and research her new book. She and Gus continue their ritual of exchanging snarky, handwritten notes across their facing kitchen tables, little anchors of companionship, and when he nervously shares his phone number, she replies in kind. Progress comes in fits and starts. She manages words, errands, and the painful business of sorting her late father's house, but grief and loneliness keep surfacing. A walk to the beach dissolves into a private breakdown. January cries until a seagull soils her hair, an absurd, humiliating punctuation, and finds Gus waiting on the path. He hugs her awkwardly but sincerely. The touch comforts and confuses her. Small, strange flirtations follow. Jokes about helicopter dates, teasing plans, and a drive-in triple feature. Later, the intimacy escalates in the back of her car. A hot, clumsy, desperate kiss that feels like both a return to something and a sharp, risky departure. Gus sets a rule afterward. One time. It's unclear what that means to either of them, and when his car disappears the next day, January spirals with rationalizations and fear that the brief intimacy cost her their friendship. She tries to steady herself by writing. The circus family she's inventing reshapes into something richer. Eleanor and her troupe, secrets tucked into vaudeville lives, a week-long story in Tulsa with stakes and a gun and a pressure cooker finale. The chapter closes with January determined to build an anti-romance that's both satisfying and true to the complicated people she knows, and aching at the new, fragile complication Gus has become. January drops into Pete's bookstore to sign copies of local authors and is struck by increasingly awkward revelations. Pete is not only Gus's aunt but calls him by his last name out of habit, and casually mentions things about Gus's life January never knew. His difficult birthday, a split, and finally that he was once married. The news lands like a cold wave. January's mental map of the man she's been getting close to unravels. The private, rule-bound neighbor who derides happy endings has layers she didn't see. As she signs, Pete insists January be patient with Gus. She believes he genuinely likes her. That both comforts and unsettles January. The chapter traces the emotional fallout. She wrestles with anger, at Gus for hiding this part of himself, at herself for caring, and with grief that her belief in love feels challenged by one more secret. Still, the visit at the counter leaves a tender note. Pete's gentle squeeze, a small human anchor, reminding January that compassion sometimes steadies more than answers. Beneath the surface, the chapter deepens the novel's central tension. The gulf between public persona and private pain, and how half-revealed pasts complicate the fragile work of new intimacy. January leaves the shop wobbly but resolved, hurt, curious, and more determined than ever to keep writing the book that might finally make sense of complicated love. Gus returns after disappearing for days. January is equal parts relieved and unmoored. His "sorry I've been" note untethers her routine, and she tries to preserve focus on her manuscript. Small domestic business follows. She photographs Sonia's porch furniture to sell and, after a hesitant clipped email, asks if Sonia wants it back. The tiny domestic tasks are an island of control in a life full of loose ends. Then Dave arrives unexpectedly at Gus's house. The Olive Garden no-show who drove out to reconcile the past. January slides into Gus's office and listens as Dave recounts a childhood shaped by fate and fire, lightning striking him, his mother interpreting it as a sign, New Eden's recruitment, the first smaller trailer fire, and the trauma that pushed Dave's mother to pull him out. He explains the cult language of atoning, the moral contortions families made, and the unbearable mix of destiny and guilt that haunts survivors. Gus listens, taking notes. January watches him soften as the interview chases down its wreckage. After the 4-hour session they sit together in the kitchen. Gus offers scotch. January wants answers about his family, marriage, his silences, and doesn't get them. Only a small reveal, a tattoo, and a worn intimacy between two people who keep leaning on things. The chapter ends on brittle tenderness. A doorjam-leaning Gus, a January who both craves more and resents being kept at arm's length. The book's emotional engine. How private pain shapes public personas and the danger of wanting someone who won't fully show up, keeps turning, unresolved and urgent. Gus texts about a tux and January shows up in ankle boots, ready to keep their deal and push him into rom-com territory. Instead of a ballroom, he drags her to a packed country bar for line dancing night, and the scene is a perfect chaotic rom-com setup. Too much flannel, bad collars, sticky floors, spilled peanuts, and a caller who sounds like an auctioneer. They tumble through the dances, trade quips, take shots, and keep touching in ways that make January both giddy and furious. The flirting breaks, hard, when a careless offhand about happy endings lights a fuse in January. She explodes with hurt and accusation. Gus has been keeping big parts of his life secret, a marriage, a divorce, and she feels mocked for still believing in lasting love. Gus fires back. The marriage hurt him profoundly. His wife left him for his college roommate on his birthday, and his reticence isn't judgmental cowardice so much as survival. In the parking lot confrontation he finally names the shame he's carried. Parker sits with the embarrassment, and for the first time lets January see the boy behind the crabby, sardonic exterior. They collapse into an awkward, healing hug. January says, "She should have picked you," and she means it. What she offers is simple and fierce compassion. Gus, softened and unarmed, admits he finds her bravery admirable and confesses that not believing in happy endings doesn't stop him from wanting one. They go for coffee, an attempt at normalcy, and January wakes the next morning with a hangover and Gus's terse first text. Our small human punctuation to a night that shifted their terms. The chapter is about ruptures and the fragile work of witnessing someone's hurt. Secrets fracture trust, but vulnerability can also reset it. Romantic tension and comic surfaces remain. Line dances, whiskey, bad choreography. But the emotional core is a sudden, honest exchange that alters how both characters can be seen by the other. January and Gus recover from their Meg Ryan/tequila hangover by collapsing on chaise lounges and swapping work-by-note banter. A casual margarita request turns into an easy evening of porch writing, falling stars and small, charged silences. When January notices Gus's new tattoo, he names Naomi, his ex-wife, and explains the Mobius strip tattoo they got together. What sounded like a poetic symbol becomes a bitter joke after the marriage ended. An image of being near someone but somehow never together. They trade honest stories. Gus about Naomi, an impenetrable visual artist, and the way people have repeatedly failed to choose him. January about Jacques and how grief changed what she wanted from love. The two reveal how their past shaped them, the ways their parents' choices taught them how or how not to love. When January breaks down over her father's secrets, Gus holds her with steadiness and tenderness. That comfort dissolves the last of the performative distance between them. They move into heated intimacy, only to be snapped back to reality by a doorbell delivering takeout. The chapter closes with a small, fragile truce. Apologies left unsaid, connection deepened, and the nightly ritual of tomorrow now meaningfully renewed. January and Gus continue the research interviews into New Eden, this time visiting Dave's mother, Julianne. The house is tidy and ordinary, but its stories are raw. Julianne offers a complicated defense of the group. New Eden first gave people hope and structure, answers to a life that felt broken, and only later did punishments and coercion creep in. Her account softens the black and white villain narrative, showing how decent, exhausted people can be swept into harmful systems when they're desperate for meaning. After the interview, the pair walk down to the beach, trading small observations and larger confessions. January unpacks memories of her parents' separation and her father's later betrayal. Julianne's explanation reframes how the vulnerable get pulled into cults. Gus opens up about his childhood caretaking role and the ways his father's illness and abuse warped his sense of responsibility, safety, and intimacy. January refuses to pity him. She insists she cares because she likes him, and Gus admits, quietly and awkwardly, that he does care for her too. The scene closes with them holding hands in the tangerine light, content, steady, and wary of what may come next. January wakes up on the couch with Gus after they spent an entire night watching movies, talking, and drifting into sleep with their legs tangled together. The morning is cold and quiet, and she tries not to wake him as she makes coffee. She texts with Shadi, who reveals she's fallen in love and is being invited to meet a guy's family over the upcoming holiday. January misses her but doesn't want to pull her away from something good, so she tells her to visit in August. She also receives an email from Sonia, who gently asks if they can talk in person about the porch furniture. Gus wanders into the kitchen looking rumpled and sleepy, and they fall into their usual rhythm of teasing and easy conversation, heading out to the porch with their coffee. Later, at January's house, as they work and wait for a buyer to pick up furniture, she snoops through Gus's bookshelf and finds his high school yearbook. The photo of teenage Gus hits her. He looks tired, hollow, recently hurt. Gus tells her it was taken after his mother's death, before he dropped out, and that his uncle later hired him at a cemetery. The sadness she feels over what he went through mixes with the growing physical closeness between them. While standing pressed together looking at the photo, his hands move lightly over her hips, and she moves with him, both of them pushing unspoken boundaries they've been circling for days. When the conversation shifts to plans for the 4th of July and the New Eden trip, January realizes she can't afford to bring anything to Pete and Maggie's party. Gus reassures her she doesn't have to, but January goes downstairs to continue cleaning and preparing the house for selling. She forces herself to enter the basement, which she's avoided because it still holds traces of her father. The single missing light bulb, the dusty tools, and even imagining him down there replacing the bulb hits her with a sharp wave of grief. Gus arrives unexpectedly, startling her. He explains the door was open and he worried. They trade small jokes, but the atmosphere shifts quickly. Standing close in the dim light, the tension that's been building between them finally breaks. They touch each other with escalating urgency until Gus pulls her into a deep, consuming kiss. The physical intensity grows fast. His hands under her shirt, her bra slipping away, their bodies pressed together against the tool rack as they kiss harder, hungrier, everything rough and slow and desperate. They lose themselves completely in the moment, ignoring the consequences that are guaranteed to come later. January and Gus' passion explodes in the basement and continues with an urgent, breathless scramble to Gus's house. Condoms are found, clothes are tossed, and they collapse into a raw, hungry, deeply physical encounter among his bookshelves. Afterwards, they lie tangled and tender, Gus whispering that he's wanted her for a long time, longer than she realized. Then he is pulled away by a sudden serious phone call and leaves to take it, leaving January exposed and anxious. They regroup later to go to Pete and Maggie's 4th of July cookout. January dresses quickly, still raw from what happened, and they arrive to a warm, crowded backyard full of friends, blue punch, Labradorite talk, and affectionate family teasing. Gus is at his most at ease with people who love him, and January watches him relax and reveal a softer side she hasn't often seen. His dimple, his lighter expression, and she savors that intimate glimpse of him. The party is social and chatty. Maggie and Pete fuss over guests, introduce strange topics, stones, Labradorite, and hand out infamous blue punch that Gus and January sardonically endure. Casual, affectionate moments, cheek-pinching jokes, offers of swimsuits, yards of loving neighbors, mix with the tender residue of their morning together. At one point, January tries to close the distance again, asking to accompany Gus into the bathroom in a flirtatious test of closeness. For reasons that sting her, he declines and goes off alone, leaving her feeling mortified and discarded. Her hope and excitement curdle into confusion. He'd just told her he'd wanted her for so long, yet here he seems to pull away at a small, vulnerable ask. Later, an email from Gus, sent almost offhand, says only that there's an event at Pete's bookstore on August 2nd at 7 p.m., and January realizes she's just agreed to a joint public appearance with him. Alone with her thoughts amid the party noise, she reconsiders everything. She knows Gus's walls, his past, his fear of closeness, and that being with him likely means eventual heartbreak. Still, despite the risk and the painful ambivalence his actions inspire, she acknowledges that she wants exactly him. His messiness and contradictions, and braces herself for whatever that will cost. January and Gus spend the 4th of July at Pete and Maggie's lively backyard cookout where the easy, affectionate community side of Gus shows through. After an awkward, tension-filled drive home, Gus invites January to join him the next day on a research trip to New Eden. Despite storms and miscommunications, she goes. They hike through rain-soaked woods to the charred, haunting ruin of the cult compound. At the site, Gus digs into the burned trailers and the dark history, while January struggles with feeling both excluded and determined to stay with him. He repeatedly pushes her away for her own protection, but ultimately returns to the tent, explains himself, and finally confesses his fear and desire. He wants January in every way but is terrified of hurting her because he's a wreck: divorce, meds, therapy, fear of loss. They reconcile in a quiet, vulnerable kiss that ends the chapter with them together, and more honest about what they want. After their emotional confrontation in the tent, January and Gus finally give in to each other fully. They undress in the dark, slowly and intimately, and make love in a calmer, more tender way than before. It's not rushed or desperate this time. They take their time studying each other, touching and kissing with care. Gus whispers to January that she's perfect, and they explore each other's bodies with complete openness. They continue through the night, having sex multiple times, stopping only for food from Gus's backpack and talking, kissing, and resting under the blanket. The next morning they dress in their still damp clothes and hike back together, hand in hand. Gus keeps holding her hand in the car, kissing it, and acting warm and openly affectionate. January feels like she has the lighter, happier version of Gus again, the one she saw at Pete and Maggie's. She also feels like she herself is finally changing back into someone who can feel joy again. They stop at a diner for breakfast, where January sneaks off to call Shoddy, who is stunned and excited when she hears that January and Gus have really gotten together. January returns to the table to find Gus being openly affectionate, touching her knee and smiling at her. They go from breakfast to a bookstore, which barely stocks January's books, then to a bar where they drink and talk. January asks Gus why he tried to keep her from going to New Eden. Gus explains that he never wanted January to see the world the way he does. Dark, cynical, broken. He says the bet was her idea, and that he actually hoped she'd realize writing like him didn't suit her because the way she sees the world is incredible. He says she makes the world look brighter in her writing, and that he never wanted that to dim. He admits he admires that about her and that her view of life gives meaning to ugly things. This conversation leads January to share her own struggles about forgiving her dad and how she tried to do the math of whether he was still good despite his mistakes. She concludes that people aren't math problems and that good moments still exist alongside pain. Gus listens, understanding her more deeply. They hold hands, and Gus tells her the world only needs January, not snowflakes or positivity, just her. Later, Gus spends the night at January's house again. January receives a text from her editor reminding her of the September 1st deadline. Panicked, she promises she'll make it. Gus wakes up beside her affectionately, teasing her, and they end up having sex again on the kitchen table before she tries to focus on writing. But focusing becomes difficult because their relationship is intense and distracting. They come up with a system. Write a certain number of words before seeing each other, doubling the count if they want to touch. They pass notes back and forth, flirt constantly, and visit restaurants and bars together in the evenings. Gus acts openly like her boyfriend around town, keeping a hand on her back, on her hips, or holding her hand in public. One night after dinner they stop by Pete's bookstore. Maggie and Pete tell them it's the anniversary of their move to town and pour wine for everyone. January and Gus stay drinking and laughing until midnight. Gus pulls her onto his lap, touching her back and holding her close while they talk with Pete and Maggie. Too tipsy to drive home, they walk together through the warm night air, holding hands. January realizes she's falling in love with Gus. Fully, undeniably. When they reach their street, they choose not to go home but instead go straight down to the lake to fulfill their Friday ritual. They strip naked and run screaming into the icy water. It's freezing, but they cling to each other and laugh through the shock. And then, abruptly and sincerely, Gus says, "I love you." He keeps saying it, kissing her face and holding her in the cold lake as a plastic bag floats by. January tells him she loves him too. Gus grins, reminding her she once promised she wouldn't fall in love with him. January and Gus stand at the top of the stairs outside the master bedroom of her father's house. Inside, the bedroom is tidy but impersonal. January searches drawers and finds them empty. On a round table she discovers a porcelain box and, below, a locked safe with a keypad. She and Gus try a code, it fails. The possibility that Sonia might know the combination occurs to January, and she considers emailing Sonia but resists. She tells herself the safe is minor and focuses on practical matters, finishing her book and preparing the house for sale. January decides to set strict boundaries to finish her manuscript. She bans Gus from the house except for an hour each night and isolates herself in the second bedroom to write. She works obsessively and reaches the final chapter of her novel, Family Intereds Docs, on Saturday, August 2nd. Initially she contemplates a tidy ending for her character Eleanor, unresolved but cyclical, but ultimately cannot leave it that way. January rewrites a final scene in which white wildflowers, pollen mistaken for snow, appear and Eleanor looks forward uncertainly to what comes next. She saves the draft and emails it to her editor, Anya, with a note asking not to be hated. The next morning January drives to FedEx to print the draft so she can hold it physically. Back home, Gus lounges on the couch and responds supportively when she reports finishing the manuscript. They banter about book sales and deadlines. Both have drafts nearing completion. January has hers. Gus says he's close with his. They prepare for the bookstore event that evening. January showers and dresses in the thrift sundress. They walk to the shop together. Pete and Maggie prepare a modest event, a display table and about 10 folding chairs. At the reading, January feels increasingly anxious when she notices Gus's demeanor change. He appears pale and distracted. She follows his gaze and sees Naomi in the audience, a striking woman with dark curls. Naomi's presence signals trouble. Gus offers to speak with Naomi. He stands and crosses the store. The Q&A proceeds with January answering routine questions while tension builds. Pete tries to handle Naomi, and Maggie and others step in to keep the scene from escalating. The small audience shifts uncomfortably. January senses Naomi has come with intent, and that whatever Naomi wants to say is aimed at Gus. Gus departs the event to find Naomi. January, shaken and unable to listen, slips out to the back alley and then walks home distraught. At her house, someone rises from the wicker couch. It is Sonia. Sonia apologizes for startling January and pleads for 5 minutes to talk, saying she has written things down this time and that there are facts January does not know that will help. The chapter ends with Sonia asking for a conversation, implying she has revelations about January's father or other hidden truths she believes January should hear. Key beats, empty drawers and a locked safe in the master bedroom, January's obsessive writing routine and finishing the manuscript, printing the draft at FedEx, supportive moment with Gus, bookstore event disrupted by Naomi's arrival, Gus's interaction with Naomi and subsequent disappearance from the reading, January returning home to find Sonia waiting to talk and claiming she has important information. January refuses to listen at first when Sonia arrives on her porch, but Sonia insists she must explain because Walt, January's father, asked her to deliver the truth. Sonia recounts her long history with Walt. They were teenage sweethearts, lost contact for many years, then reconnected when Walt was newly separated. They became involved again while Walt's wife was ill. Sonia believed their second chance might turn into a life together, but Walt's responsibilities and loyalty to his wife pulled him back. Sonia describes the heartbreak of being the distraction, who loved him in imperfect circumstances, and she admits she's humiliated and sorry. She reveals that when Walt died he sent her a letter, a key, and instructions for her to give these to January, asking Sonia to make sure January learned the whole truth and, in Sonia's words, perhaps to help January forgive him. Sonia also reveals there are more letters than January had known. This shocks January. She had refused to read the single letter earlier because it represented the last new thing she could have from her father. Sonia urges her to open the rest, arguing that these are pieces of Walt that belong to January. Alone, January retrieves the box from the safe in the master bedroom. She reads Walt's dated letter excerpted in the kitchen. He explains that he's been writing a letter each birthday for her, and the note references the safe code and 1401 Queens Beach Lane. When she opens the safe using the birthday code, she finds a thick stack of envelopes, each labeled to her and bound together, plus a marina key with the tag Sweet Harbor Marina, North Bare Shores MI. She is overwhelmed. The letters are physical traces of her father, written on her birthdays through the years. January drives to the marina, boards the boat identified by name, and sits with the letters. She reads the first several letters. Samples are rendered in the text. Early birthday letters are affectionate and domestic, full of small anecdotes about spaghetti, scars, childhood misadventures, reflections on family and fatherly tenderness. As the letters progress through the years, Walt grows candid. He confesses his infidelity, names Sonia as someone he loved in the past and later became involved with again, and admits he had affairs while trying to reconcile his fear, his marriage, and his identity. He writes often about his deep love for January, his pride in her, and his attempts to be honest in the letters so she can fully know him. He explains the tension between wanting to be the father and husband her mother needed and the self he lost and sought elsewhere. In later birthday letters he returns to tenderness and regret, expressing hope that January will understand and not give up on him. Reading them in the boat, January is undone. She experiences a cascade of conflicting emotions, betrayal, grief, anger, and the pain of finally seeing the fuller truth about her father's life. The letters force her to confront the unreliability of memories and the impossibility of ever fully knowing someone, even a parent. Sonia's presence and the letters together reveal how Walt led a divided life. Moments of devoted fatherhood and earnest love, alongside choices that caused harm and eventual concealment. Yet the letters also show his consistent devotion to January, and a deliberate attempt to leave her tangible traces of himself. By the section's end, January acknowledges the damage. The beautiful lies are gone, but she also recognizes that she still has the house by the water, the letters, and the key. Sonia's plea and Walt's own recorded words leave her with complex, painful knowledge. Though the revelations break her open, she remains standing and resolves to hold what she can from her father's legacy, even while grappling with what she now knows. At Pete and Maggie's 4th of July cookout, January feels awkward and self-conscious in a borrowed Saga swimsuit, while Gus mostly keeps to himself, teasing about the pool and avoiding full participation. Maggie and Pete fuss over guests, offer blue punch, and warmly include January. Small-town friendliness and eccentricities, like Labradorite talk, frame the gathering. Gus drifts between polite interactions and private withdrawal. At moments he is present and gentle with January, and at others he slides inward, prompting her insecurity. He repeatedly gives mixed signals, inviting her then seeming distant, and when they leave, the tension intensifies. Back home that night, January wrestles with confusion and hurt about Gus's behavior. His flippancy, a brusque message about their research plans, and his unclear signals leave her wondering whether he wants her involved at all. A stormy morning follows. January writes and reaches 40,000 words on her book, distracted by her feelings about Gus. He confirms the New Eden trip is still happening despite bad weather, and asks if she has hiking boots. Their texts show miscommunication and emotional distance. Gus alternately assures her she's invited and then tells her he doesn't want her to feel obligated. When he says he wants her to come, she is relieved, but his earlier ambivalence has made her anxious. She dresses, and Gus arrives with extra gear and muddy boots. They drive through rain and woods to New Eden, a charred cult site they both have photographed before. Arriving, January is horrified by the burned trailers and the recent violence. Father Abe's nursery, where people burned, is particularly traumatic. Gus shifts into professional mode, taking photos mapping the site, and tries to shield January, suggesting she wait in the tent. She refuses to be left alone and follows him into the ruins. He reluctantly tells her the trailer belonged to Father Abe and mentions the dead man. January feels nauseated at the horror of it. Gus asks her to wait in the tent to warm up, and she complies with shock and feeling pushed away. Inside the tent, rain and cold make January vulnerable. After some time, Gus returns dripping and apologetic. He explains the phone call from the prior day belonged to his friend Kayla Markham, who is his lawyer and handling his divorce, not Naomi. He reveals he'd told Markham about January and their arrangement. She warned him against it because January is leaving soon. As the conversation unfolds, Gus confesses long-hidden feelings. He admits wanting January for a long time, describes his past feelings in college, and explains his fear of hurting her because he's a wreck, in therapy, on medication, trapped in an unresolved marriage. He says he wants to be with her but fears he can't give her the stability she deserves. January demands clarity. After heated exchange, Gus finally says plainly he wants her in every way but is scared of causing her pain. She tells him to let her be happy with him. They kiss and reconcile, and he pulls her close. The trip ends with a fragile understanding. Gus admits his fear and past mistakes, and January accepts him, asking to be happy with him despite the potential messiness. After New Eden, January and Gus are intimate in a softer, slower way than their basement encounter. They undress, touch, and make love multiple times in the tent during the night. The intimacy is described as reverent and mutual, with Gus careful and adoring. They share provisions, conversation, and laughter afterward. In the morning they pack, drive back, stop at a diner, where January whispers excitedly to Shoddy, and then visit a bookstore and a bar. The day is composed of small domestic pleasures and easy companionship. Gus jokes about bad reviews, they sip drinks, and they connect through shared humor and affectionate touches. January asks Gus about his motive for keeping her from New Eden. He explains he never wanted to distort her worldview or make her lose her bright outlook, and he admits that the original bet was her idea. He says he hoped she would realize his life and writing weren't for her because she makes the world brighter. He didn't want to dim that. Their bond deepens into mutual admiration. Gus acknowledges her ability to make beautiful things. January admits how his presence is slowly thawing her hardened places. Back home, Anya, January's editor, texts a hard deadline for a manuscript on September 1st. January commits and starts writing immediately despite the distractions of Gus and their sexual relationship. They try to create a working arrangement, writing separately by day and sharing incentives like word count goals to reward intimacy. Their relationship blends intense physical desire with creative collaboration. They set word count rules that allow them to be together after meeting targets. They begin to integrate into local life, attending Pete and Maggie's, going out to restaurants and bars, and appearing publicly together, sometimes with Gus holding her hand or keeping a protective, gentle physical connection. At night they sometimes run naked into the lake, where Gus declares his love and January responds in kind. He says, "I love you," and she replies, "I know." Their love grows quickly. January realizes she is beginning to love him, and by the end of the section they are sharing a life that mixes passion, mutual support, and creative rivalry. Still fragile, but full of warmth, shared routines and hope. The section ends with the sense that things are both precarious and real. January and Gus stand before the master bedroom safe. January fears the discovery inside and the truths it might reveal about her father. Inside the room she finds a clean but impersonal space. The small porcelain box she first checks is empty, but under a tablecloth they discover a gray safe. They try likely codes. When January uses her birthday as the code, the number referenced in Walt's letter, the safe opens. The safe contains a stack of letters, each addressed to January, apparently written every birthday, and a marina key labeled Sweet Harbor Marina, North Bare Shores MI. The discovery overwhelms her with jealousy, sadness, and a sense of loss. She realizes there are parts of her father she never knew and that Sonia had them. Rather than destroy the house, January decides she can still sell it and continue her life. But she also recognizes the emotional complexity of staying. She focuses on her work, imposing a strict timer to limit Gus's company so she can write. She reaches the novel's final chapter and then adds a final softer coda. Wildflowers, not snow, scattering down the road as the circus family moves on. A choice that gives the story hope and allows her to send the manuscript to her editor, Anya, while bracing for fallout from the publisher, Sandy, and possible professional repercussions. She prints the draft, returns, and gives it to Gus, who is encouraging and confident she will sell the book, though it may not be exactly what Sandy expects. They prepare for the bookstore event at Pete's. At the event, Pete and Maggie host an intimate reading and Q&A. January and Gus participate. During the event, Naomi, Gus's estranged wife, unexpectedly appears. Her presence makes Gus visibly tense and forces him to step away to talk with her privately. January is shaken and realizes Naomi's arrival signals unresolved threads in Gus's life. After the event, the crowd disperses. January feels sick with anxiety and fear about the implications of Naomi's presence and what she might mean for her and Gus. She returns home shaken, and Sonia appears on her porch again asking for 5 minutes. She insists there is more to tell and says she has written everything down to help January understand. The chapter closes with a sense that January's discovery of the safe and letters, the bookstore confrontation with Naomi, and Sonia's renewed insistence are catalysts that will force January to confront hidden truths about her father, about Gus, and about the choices she must make. January and Shadi spend a long, stormy night talking, drinking, and crying. Shadi comforts January, teases her about falling in love, and ultimately tells her she thinks January was due to fall, and that she senses Gus loves her. Later, pounding on the door interrupts their exhausted sleep. When January opens the door, there is no one, and she runs outside barefoot but finds Gus's car gone. She is devastated at having missed him. Then lights and music erupt from Gus's house. Gus appears in the rain, soaked, and having blared, "Nothing compares to you." He had intended to dance with January in the rain and tries to create a moment to talk. They dance awkwardly as thunder passes. January asks bluntly whether Naomi was the woman at the bookstore. Gus confirms Naomi asked to talk. She told him she wanted to try to get back together. He explains he went for a drink with Naomi and that she asked if he could forgive her and possibly be with her again. He admits he initially thought reconciliation might be possible, but realized he didn't mean it about January. He tells January he can imagine being with Naomi again, but when he thinks about being with January, he feels no claustrophobia, only happiness. He says he wants ordinary life with her, laundry, bad green juice cleanses, antiques, that he trusts her more than anyone, and that he wants to try to give her what she deserves. January, raw and tearful, says neither of them can promise a happy ending. Gus acknowledges uncertainty but asks to be allowed to prove he can love her. They both admit they are wrecks, but Gus urges starting from where they are. He offers the practical, immediate compromise. Enjoy what they have now. Happy for now. January accepts the idea, and they stand in the rain, holding each other and learning in that moment to dance together. January and Gus are now 9 months into a life that has shifted dramatically over the prior year. Both have finished manuscripts, sold books, and rejected pen names. Their careers are stabilizing even as their personal lives remain messy but full of mutual care. They trade and read each other's new books. January's The Great Family Marconi and Gus's Draft The Cup Is Already Broken, compare their endings and aesthetics, and enjoy quiet, domestic moments. Reading together on the beach, sharing coffee in the mornings, and tolerating small annoyances like noisy neighbors. They continue navigating the fallout of past relationships and wounds. Naomi's history with Gus, family secrets revealed earlier, but are committed to being present with each other. Both writers observe and reflect on the nature of endings and the limits of control. Gus's novel contains a darkly sudden catastrophe, a meteor and a fatal car crash, that leaves January moved and in tears, because the character's sudden fate feels both unfair and strangely beautiful. She wrestles with vulnerability and the fragility of happiness. The couple finds comfort in small rituals. Long winter walks on the frozen lake, nights spent tangled in blankets and laughter, and improvisational intimacy in kitchens and on chilly porches, which build a sense of ordinary partnership that January had previously feared she couldn't trust. They discuss their books' receptions. January's book sold before Gus's, but both have reasons to be proud. Trade reviews come in and Anya, January's agent/editor, pressures for deadlines, while Gus finishes line edits. The pair face the mundane realities of publicity and publishing. Advanced copies arrive in a box on their porch, and experience genuine joy seeing the physical book. Gus includes a dedication in his book that is explicitly for January. For January. I don't care how the story ends as long as I spend it with you. An intimate gesture that moves her to tears and publicly cements his emotional commitment. January reflects on grief, memory, and her father's letters from earlier chapters, and how those discoveries reshaped her sense of family and self. In the present, she recognizes that even with the past's complicated truths, she can still experience new love without erasing that history. The text repeatedly contrasts happy for now with guaranteed happy endings. Both characters accept uncertainty and choose to value the present. Gus articulates this plainly. He cannot promise forever, but he wants to try and believes the life with January will be worth the risks. The chapter closes in a quietly celebratory tone. The couple shares the advance copies on a perfect evening, exchanges tender, comic banter, and declares love. January tells Gus she loves him by his full name. He answers in kind. The scene emphasizes that their relationship is not an absolute culmination but an accumulation of happy for nows. A sustained, fragile, meaningful present they choose together.